This is a story about what makes America truly exceptional. Not that we're always first, not that we're always right, but that we have the courage to learn from anyone, even our enemies. The courage to admit when we're wrong. That intellectual honesty, that humility in the face of truth, that's what made America great. And what this story proves is still making us great today. If you lived through the Cold War, you'll recognize every moment of fear in this story. If you built fallout shelters, practiced ducks and cover drills, or served in the military when nuclear war seemed inevitable, this story is for you. Because what happened in a frozen Nevada hangar in 1960 would prove that America's greatest weapon wasn't our bombs, it was our willingness to learn. November 1960, classified hangar deep in Nevada desert. The air was refrigerated to precisely 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to see breath, cold enough to preserve metal from oxidation, cold enough to make three men in white laboratory coats stand motionless staring at an object that should not exist. Before them on a steel examination table lay a single propeller blade, 18 feet long from tip to hub. Its surface gleamed with a metallic sheen that caught fluorescent light and threw it back in patterns that seemed almost organic. The blade was swept at an impossible angle, 45 degrees at the tip, curving back like the wing of some predatory bird frozen in mid-dive. And according to every law of aerodynamics that Dr. Robert Harrison knew, according to how in every textbook he had written, according to 23 years of designing propellers for the United States military, this blade should not work, should not fly, should not exist. But it did exist, and it flew. Soviet bombers flew with these propellers at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, carrying nuclear weapons capable of destroying American cities. Flying missions that made American air defenses look obsolete. How did Soviet engineers achieve what America's best minds said was impossible? The answer would humble the most confident man in American propeller design. But to understand that answer, we must return to where this impossible blade was born. In desperation, terror, and the shadow of Stalin's death sentence. Dr. Robert Harrison was 52 years old that November morning. Gray had come to his temples, but his hands remained steady despite the cold. He had spent 2 decades at the cutting edge of American aviation engineering, had worked on the B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had consulted on the Lockheed Constellation, the elegant airliner that revolutionized transatlantic travel, had literally written the textbooks that graduate students at MIT and Caltech memorized as gospel truth. His equations were taught in every aeronautical engineering program in America. His theories on propeller efficiency were cited in thousands of technical papers. When young engineers had questions about rotating blade dynamics, they turned to Harrison's books for answers. And now looking at this Soviet propeller blade, he could not understand how it worked. The numbers did not add up. The physics did not make sense. The sweep angle was too aggressive. The thickness distribution violated every principle he had taught for 2 decades. The twist pattern was wrong, changing through nearly 90 degrees from root to tip in a curve that defied simple mathematical description. His calculations, the same calculations that had guided American propeller design since 1940, predicted this blade should produce negative thrust, should slow the aircraft down rather than propel it forward. Harrison's equations said impossible. Soviet bombers said otherwise. 3 days earlier, those bombers had given America a gift. A crash landing in Norway that would expose the most embarrassing intelligence failure of the Cold War. But what Harrison didn't know yet, he himself had caused that failure. 10 years earlier, with a single memo that he was about to rediscover. Beside Harrison stood Dr. James Mitchell, 38, materials scientist from MIT. He examined a core sample under high magnification, his eye pressed to the lens of the microscope. Aluminum alloy with scandium, zirconium, Mitchell said without looking up. Elements we've never even considered using in propeller applications. And the grain structure, he paused, shaking his head. This isn't luck. This is systematic metallurgical innovation. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Sanders stood back from the examination table. 45. Air Force Intelligence. 2 decades tracking Soviet developments through the wonk of Cold War secrecy. He had watched American estimates be wrong before, but never this wrong. How fast can it go? Sanders asked. The question consuming every intelligence analyst in Washington. Harrison ran calculations in his head, checking numbers against theoretical limits, rechecking because the results made no sense. According to my equations, this propeller should produce negative thrust at its design operating point. It should slow the aircraft down. But it doesn't. No, Soviet Bear bombers cruise at 520 miles per hour, carrying 15 tons of bombs over 8,000 miles. We've tracked them on radar, photographed them from U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying at 70,000 feet. The performance is real. The physics I cannot explain. Harrison placed his hand on the blade surface. The metal was cold, perfectly smooth, the product of manufacturing precision that rivaled anything American industry could produce, maybe exceeded it. If you remember the Cold War, if you practiced duck and cover drills in school or built fallout shelters in your basement, leave a comment below. Your memories are history. We want to hear them. Subscribe now because this story will change how you understand that era. It will show you that America's greatest strength wasn't our weapons. It was something deeper, something you helped build. The year was 1960. The Cold War had reached its most dangerous phase. American and Soviet forces faced each other across divided Europe, each side armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilizations several times over. The balance of terror depended on each superpower's ability to deliver those weapons to their targets. If you lived through this time, you remember the fear. You remember the air raid sirens testing every Tuesday, the maps showing Soviet missiles reaching your hometown in 30 minutes, the knowledge that you might have to choose between your family and your duty. For a decade, America had enjoyed strategic superiority. The B-36 Peacemaker could strike Soviet cities from bases in the continental United States. Its 70-meter wingspan, its ability to carry 40 tons of bombs over distances exceeding 10,000 kilometers. Soviet bombers lacked the range to strike American targets and return home. Then came the Bear. First photographed by U-2 spy planes in 1954, the massive Soviet bomber had seemed impossible by every measure of Western understanding. Propeller-driven in an era when jets were dominating military aviation. Swept wings like a fighter aircraft. 4 enormous engines driving propellers that looked wrong in every photograph. Initial CIA estimate, maximum speed 350 miles per hour. Fast for a propeller aircraft, certainly, but not fast enough to evade American jet interceptors being deployed to protect the homeland. The F-86 Sabre, the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-104 Starfighter, all capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The estimates were catastrophically wrong. By 1958, those slow Soviet bombers were outrunning American interceptors. American radar operators were seeing impossible speeds and being told their equipment was broken. Because admitting Soviet propellers matched jet performance meant admitting American intelligence had failed. But that admission was coming, and it would cost careers, including Harrison's. That morning before entering the analysis facility, Harrison had eaten breakfast at a diner on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The same diner where B-29 crews had stopped for final meals before flying missions that changed history. The same booths where test pilots gathered before dangerous flights into unknown skies. He ordered what he always ordered. Eggs over easy yolks, still soft whites just set. Bacon crispy cooked the way his father had taught him bacon should be prepared in their Pennsylvania diner during the Depression years. Golden brown, fragrant. The fat rendered but not burned. Toast with real butter, not margarine and strawberry jam, his wife made every summer. Coffee strong enough to strip paint from steel. American breakfast, the kind that said home and safety in a world where America was invincible and enemies were backward peasants who could never match American innovation. The waitress was Dorothy, age 60, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had served breakfast to 3 generations of military men. Korean War pilots heading to training missions. World War II veterans working at the test ranges. Now Cold War analysts like Harrison who worked at facilities they could not discuss and carried secrets they could not share. "You okay, hun?" Dorothy refilled his coffee without being asked. 40 years serving men had taught her to read faces. See worry written in eyes and shoulders and the way hands gripped coffee cups. Just thinking about work. Must be some kind of work to make a man look that worried before he's even finished his bacon. If only she knew. That propeller blade waiting in the classified hangar represented more than an engineering mystery. It represented American vulnerability laid bare. Proof that everything comfortable America believed about Soviet inferiority might be comfortable lies told to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. The possibility that confident dismissal of enemy capabilities had left American cities, including his own family in Boston, defenseless against attack. Harrison finished his eggs. The bacon had tasted like childhood, like Saturday mornings in his parents' diner when the biggest worry was whether the Phillies would win their game. Like a world where enemies were distant and abstract and could never reach across oceans to threaten the life he knew. Many of you remember breakfasts like this. Simple, American, the kind that said everything was going to be okay. Harrison's bacon tasted like that innocence. By the time he finished examining that blade, innocence would be gone forever. He left a generous tip, drove 20 miles into the desert to the facility where the most important analysis of his career was waiting. 3 days earlier, July 1st, 1960, a Soviet Bear bomber on routine patrol over the Barents Sea had suffered catastrophic engine failure. The pilot, Major Konstantin Ivanov, had nursed the crippled aircraft across frigid waters toward the Norway coast. For 2 hours, flying on 3 engines while fuel leaked from a damaged tank. Soviet naval vessels raced to intercept, but they were too far away, too slow. Ivanov managed a controlled crash landing on a beach near Vardø, Norway. The landing was rough, the aircraft broke in 2 places, but the crew survived. And scattered across that frozen Norwegian coastline were several complete propeller blades from the failed engine. American transport aircraft collected them within hours, beat Soviet recovery ships by 15 minutes. 15 minutes separating the greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War from complete failure. Now Dr. Robert Harrison's comfortable understanding of aerodynamics was being systematically destroyed by evidence he could not refute. But to truly understand that propeller blade, to comprehend the desperation and genius that created it, we must return to where the story truly begins. Not in a Nevada desert in 1960, not on a Norwegian beach, but in Moscow, spring of 1951, in Stalin's private office in the Kremlin, where a man who had survived 6 years in the Gulag was about to receive a death sentence disguised as an engineering challenge. Before we meet the Soviet engineer who would create the impossible propeller, understand what America believed in spring of 1951. General Curtis LeMay stood before the Joint Chiefs, commander of Strategic Air Command, the man who had directed the firebombing of Japan. A voice of absolute certainty. The Soviet Union is a decade behind us in aircraft technology. Still flying modified B-29 copies we essentially gave them during the war. We have the B-36, jet bombers in development. They pose no credible strategic threat to the continental United States. Those of you who served in the military during this time remember this confidence. We'd won World War II, developed the atomic bomb first, built the most powerful economy in the world. Of course, we were technologically superior. Around the table, heads nodded. Agreement was unanimous. American technological superiority was an unquestioned article of faith. Air Force Major William Thompson, 32, an intelligence analyst, sat in the back taking notes. He raised his hand hesitantly. General, Soviet industrial capacity has grown significantly since the war's end. Should we consider the possibility of a breakthrough? LeMay's stare could freeze vodka. Major Soviet engineers are competent at copying American designs. They are not capable of innovation. We maintain our advantage through continued advancement. They play catch-up. That dynamic will not change. Thompson returned to his notes, wrote a single word in the margin. Hubris. He would remember this meeting 9 years later. When the impossible Soviet propeller arrived in Nevada, when LeMay's absolute certainty collided with Soviet reality, when America learned that dismissing enemy capabilities is the most dangerous form of arrogance, LeMay was wrong, catastrophically wrong. But understanding why requires understanding what drove Soviet engineers to attempt the impossible. Not confidence, not comfort, but terror. The terror of a man who knew that failure meant death. That man's name was Viktor Sokolov. The meeting took place on a morning when Moscow was caught between winter and spring. Snow still covered the ground, but the sun had strength enough to make it glisten. Inside Stalin's private office in the Kremlin, the temperature was kept uncomfortably warm. The Soviet dictator felt cold constantly in his old age, insisted on heat that made visitors sweat and understand their powerlessness. The office was decorated with heavy curtains of deep red. Portraits of Lenin gazed down from the walls with eyes that seemed to follow movement. The carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps. Everything designed to emphasize the power gap between the man who sat behind the massive desk and anyone who stood before it. Along one wall, a table held a Georgian feast. The foods of Stalin's homeland laid out with calculated abundance. Khachapuri cheese filled bread still steaming from the oven. The cheese was melted herbs, fragrant crust, golden brown. Shashlik lamb skewers, marinated in spices and grilled over open flame. The meat was tender, falling from the skewers, glistening with fat and seasoning. Georgian wine in crystal decanters, deep red like blood. Delicacies that most Soviet citizens never saw. Abundance designed to emphasize the distance between power and powerlessness. Stalin was 71 years old that spring. His health was failing, though few dared acknowledge it. His hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. His breathing was labored, but his grip on power remained absolute. His word was still law. His displeasure was still death. Viktor Sokolov stood before the dictator, feeling a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the overheated air. Age 54. The Soviet Union's most famous aircraft designer. His career stretched back to the earliest days of Russian aviation. He had built his first airplane in 1925 when the revolution was still fresh and anything seemed possible. But Sokolov was also a Gulag survivor, arrested in 1937 during the height of the Great Purge, charged with sabotage and espionage in accusations so obviously fabricated that even the interrogators seemed embarrassed reciting them. Sentenced to death. Sentence commuted to 15 years hard labor in camps where men died from cold and hunger and despair. Even in prison, his skills had been too valuable to waste. He was transferred to a special design bureau within the Gulag system, a Sharashka, where imprisoned engineers worked under armed guard designing weapons for the state that had imprisoned them. There, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, he had designed the tactical bomber that later proved invaluable against the Nazi invasion. Released in 1943 when the war made his expertise essential. Conviction quietly annulled, contributions rewarded with medals and honors in the fiction that the arrest had never happened. But Sokolov had not forgotten, could not forget. The interrogations were branded into memory, sleep deprivation until reality became dream and dream became reality. Accusations repeated until you signed confessions just to make the voices stop. The faces of colleagues taken away in the night and never seen again. The lesson taught with brutal efficiency. In Stalin's Soviet Union, failure was not a professional setback. Failure was a death sentence. Stalin gestured toward the feast with one hand. Eat. You are my guest. Sokolov's stomach was knotted with fear. The thought of eating made him nauseous. But refusing Stalin's hospitality was an insult, and insults carried consequences. He walked to the table, took a piece of khachapuri. The bread was warm in his hand, the cheese melted and fragrant. The herbs reminded him of his mother's kitchen from childhood before revolution and terror remade the world. He bit into the bread. It should have been delicious. The cheese was rich. The bread was perfectly baked. The herbs were fresh. It tasted like ashes in his mouth. Some of you served in war, know what fear tastes like, how even the best meal turns to dust when you're terrified. Sokolov was eating in Stalin's office. Every bite was survival. Every swallow was staying alive one moment longer. Stalin watched him struggle to chew, smiled slightly, a predator's smile. Fear was a tool. Food was a weapon. Even generosity carried threat. Good, yes, Stalin asked. His voice was quiet, conversational, the tone a grandfather might use asking a child about their day. Very good, Comrade Stalin. Thank you. Sokolov swallowed, though his throat wanted to refuse the food. Stalin spread a map across his desk. The paper crackled as it unfolded. Sokolov recognized it immediately. A map of the Northern Hemisphere. The Soviet Union in one color, the United States in another. The vast Arctic Ocean between them, marked with distances and flight paths. Stalin's finger, gnarled with age, traced a line from Moscow to Washington. 12,000 kilometers through some of the most hostile airspace on Earth. Over the Arctic ice cap where temperatures could freeze fuel in aircraft tanks. Through air defense networks designed to stop exactly this kind of penetration. The Americans have the B-36, Stalin said. Each word was precise, carefully weighted. It can reach our cities from their bases in America, can destroy Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev. Every industrial center we rebuilt are from the rubble of the Nazi invasion, can do it and return home safely. We have no defense against it. We have no bomber capable of responding in kind. This is unacceptable. Stalin's finger tapped Washington on the map. Once, twice, 3 times. Each tap like a judge's gavel pronouncing sentence. I need a bomber that can reach here, deliver its payload, return home. 15,000 kilometers total range. And I need it operational within 5 years. Sokolov felt the floor drop away beneath him. 5 years, 15,000 kilometers. The challenge was impossible by every measure of 1951 engineering understanding. The American B-36 had taken more than a decade to develop with unlimited resources and the best engineers in the world. The Soviet Union was still recovering from a war that had killed 27 million people. Resources were scarce. Industrial capacity was strained. The best engineers had died in the purges or the war. Building a bomber with that range in 5 years was asking for the moon, asking for miracles, asking for the impossible. But saying impossible to Stalin meant a return to the Gulag. Or worse, Sokolov had seen what happened to engineers who told Stalin that his demands could not be met. Their names disappeared from official records. Their families were relocated. Their existence was erased as thoroughly as if they had never been born. It will be done, Comrade Stalin, Sokolov heard himself say. The words came automatically, survival instinct overriding rational thought. Stalin looked at him directly for the first time. Eyes that had ordered millions of deaths. Eyes that showed no warmth, no mercy, no recognition that the man before him was human rather than a tool to be used and discarded. I know about your time in the camp, Sokolov. I know you understand the consequences of failure. 5 years, not 1 day more, not 1 day less, dismissed. Sokolov had 5 years to build the impossible or return to hell. But he would not work alone. He would find an engineer brilliant enough to attempt what American experts would laugh at as fantasy. An engineer driven by something deeper than fear of Stalin. An engineer who carried his dead brother's final letter in his jacket pocket every single day for 50 years. 50 Guam. What neither Viktor Sokolov nor anyone else knew that spring night, Stalin had placed an informant inside Viktor's design bureau. Senior engineer named Alexei Karpov, NKVD agent reporting directly to Beria himself. Every failure would be documented, every setback reported to Moscow, every private conversation recorded in files that could be used to justify arrest. Viktor was not just racing against technical impossibility. He was racing against a surveillance apparatus designed to destroy him at the first sign of weakness. The informant would remain hidden for 3 years, would file dozens of reports documenting supposed defeatist attitudes and suspicious activities, would nearly cause Viktor's second arrest in 1953. Only Stalin's death in March of that year would save Viktor Sokolov from a return trip to the Gulag. But he did not know that yet. On that spring night, he only knew he needed to find an engineer brilliant enough to attempt the impossible. Engineer willing to risk everything. Engineer driven by something deeper than fear of Stalin. He would find that man. His name was Dmitry Volkov. Maria Sokolova was 48 when her husband returned from the Kremlin meeting. She had married Viktor in 1929 when both were young and the future seemed to hold promise instead of terror. She had waited 6 years while he rotted in the Gulag, had raised their daughter Natasha alone through war and deprivation, had learned to read her husband's face like a book written in a language only she could understand. She knew that look, the same look he had worn when the NKVD came to arrest him in 1937, the look that said his life was no longer his own. Their apartment was 2 rooms in a building that housed other successful Soviet engineers. Luxury by Soviet standards, but cramped compared to what Viktor's position should have provided. Their daughter Natasha, aged 20, was at university studying mathematics, following in her father's footsteps toward a life built on numbers and logic. Maria was making tea when Viktor arrived home. The samovar was hot. The tea was weak because good tea was scarce, but it was tea nonetheless. Small comforts in a world that offered few comforts to anyone. She poured 2 cups without asking if he wanted any, set them on their small table, sat down and waited for him to speak. Victor sat across from her, looked at the tea, did not drink. "What did Stalin want?" Maria asked. Her voice was quiet, steady despite the fear she felt rising in her chest. 5 years to build a bomber that can reach America and return. The words hung in the air between them. Maria's hands went still around her teacup. She understood immediately what this meant, understood the impossible nature of the challenge, understood what failure would mean. "That is impossible." "I know." "What happens if you fail?" Victor did not answer, did not need to. They both knew. The Gulag was waiting, the Arctic camps where men died from cold and hunger. The sentence that had been commuted once might not be commuted again. Maria had already lost him once to Stalin's paranoia, had spent 6 years not knowing if he was alive or dead, not knowing if she would raise their daughter alone, not knowing if the knock on the door in the middle of the night would come for her as well. She could not bear to lose him again. But she also understood that the Soviet system offered no alternatives, no safe choices, only varying degrees of danger. "Then you must not fail," she said finally. Her voice was steady though her hands were shaking. "Whatever it takes, whatever you must do, whatever compromises you must make, come home to us." That night after Maria had fallen asleep, Viktor Sokolov wrote a letter to his daughter. He sealed it in an envelope, left it with Maria with careful instructions. "If I do not survive this project, if I am arrested or disappear, give this to Natasha after I am gone." The letter said what he could not say to her face, about how proud he was of her accomplishments, about his hopes for her future, about his love that transcended fear and duty, and all the brutality that the Soviet state demanded. Maria kept that letter in their bureau drawer. Sometimes she took it out when Victor was working late, held it, wondered if she would need to open it, wondered if her husband would survive building the impossible under a threat of death. The letter would stay sealed for 6 years, through Stalin's death, through Khrushchev's rise to power, through the development and deployment of the bomber that would change the strategic balance between superpowers. But Maria didn't know that yet. On that spring night in 1951, she only knew her husband had been given an impossible task. And somewhere in the Soviet Union, there was an engineer who would attempt it, not just from fear, but from a promise made to a dying brother. A promise that would drive him to discover what Americans said could not be discovered. The man tasked with designing the impossible engines was 34 years old in 1951, a full generation younger than Sokolov, born after the revolution, raised during the brutal industrialization drives of the 1930s, when Stalin transformed the Soviet Union from a peasant society to industrial power through methods that killed millions. Dmitry Volkov had learned his craft building tank engines during the Great Patriotic War. While German panzers rolled across Soviet territory, while cities burned and populations fled, Volkov worked in factories east of the Urals, designing diesel engines for the T-34 tank, the armored vehicle that would ultimately turn the tide against the Nazi invasion. He learned valuable lessons in those years. How to design engines that survived brutal combat conditions, engines that kept running when damage poorly maintained pushed far beyond their design specifications, engines simple and OM that conscripts with minimal training could repair them with hammers and wire and desperate ingenuity. But Volkov carried a wound deeper than any combat injury. His older brother Andrei had died during the siege of Leningrad, age 22, starved to death in the winter of 1942 when the city was surrounded and cut off and 1 million people perished from hunger and cold and disease. Andrei had been studying engineering when the war began, had enlisted immediately, had been trapped in Leningrad when the siege closed like iron jaws around the city. For 900 days, Leningrad held out. And during those days, people died at a rate that made the word genocide seem inadequate. Before dying, Andrei had written a final letter to his younger brother. The letter was carried out of Leningrad by a soldier being evacuated with frostbite, delivered to Dmitry 6 months after Andrei's death. Dmitry had carried that letter folded in his jacket pocket every day since. The paper was worn now, creased from being opened and refolded thousands of times. The ink was faded, but Dmitry could recite every word from memory. He read it when design challenges seemed insurmountable, when despair threatened to overwhelm determination, when he needed to remember why the work mattered. Little brother, the letter said in Andre's careful handwriting, weak from starvation but still precise, still showing the engineer's mind that thought in straight lines and clean solutions. If you survive this war, build something that prevents future wars. Build engines so powerful that no enemy will dare attack Mother Russia again. Build them so our children never know the hunger that is killing me. This is my dying wish. This is your purpose. Volkov had devoted his life to fulfilling that promise. And when Sokolov approached him about the bomber project, when he explained Stalin's impossible demand, Volkov did not hesitate. I will do it, he said simply. Whatever it takes. Many of you lost brothers in war, sons, friends. You understand what it means to carry that loss, to make promises to the dead, to work not just for yourself, but for the memory of those who didn't come home. Volkov worked for Andrei every day for 50 years. That's the kind of devotion your generation understands. While Soviet engineers worked through nights in a frozen facility, an American family lived a different reality. Robert and Helen Morrison, 2 children ages 8 and 6, suburban home outside Hartford, Connecticut, white picket fence, 2-car garage, new television in the living room, the American dream incarnate, their basement newly installed fallout shelter. Cost $3,000. Robert's entire annual salary as an insurance salesman, but worth it for peace of mind. Steel door, ventilation system, shelves stocked with canned food and water. Geiger counter on the wall. Many of you built shelters like this, or knew families who did, spent money you didn't have because protecting your family mattered more than anything. You remember those yellow civil defense signs? Duck and cover drills in schools. The belief that concrete and canned beans could save you from nuclear war. Every Tuesday at noon, civil defense sirens tested throughout Connecticut. Every Tuesday, Helen Morrison's heart stopped for 5 seconds until she remembered just a test. Not real, not yet. She asked Robert the same question every Tuesday. Is this the real one? Robert always reassured her, no honey, just a test. And even if the Soviets wanted to attack, they don't have bombers that can reach us here. Their technology is 10 years behind ours. We're safe. Helen wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. What neither Robert nor Helen Morrison knew, Soviet engineers were 6 months away from a successful test of an engine that would make their fallout shelter obsolete, would make every American suburb vulnerable, would prove that expensive peace of mind was just expensive delusion. That belief in American technological superiority, that comfortable assumption that Soviets could never match American innovation, wouldn't survive the decade. The Morrison family wasn't alone in their false security. Millions of American families believed the same thing, built the same shelters, had the same faith in American superiority. That faith would be shattered, not suddenly, but gradually, as radar operators saw impossible speeds and were told their equipment was broken, as intelligence analysts found evidence contradicting comfortable assumptions and were told to check their sources, as truth slowly emerged that America had catastrophically underestimated the enemy. That reckoning was coming, and Dr. Robert Harrison would be the man forced to deliver it. Volkov understood the key challenge lay not in the engines themselves, but in the propellers they would drive. Building a 15,000 horsepower turbine was difficult, but achievable with existing Soviet technology. They had the metallurgical knowledge, the manufacturing capability, the theoretical understanding of gas turbine dynamics. The real problem was converting that power into thrust efficiently enough to achieve the range Stalin demanded. And that meant solving the propeller problem, a problem that had defeated every aerodynamics expert in the world. Volkov explained it to Sokolov using an analogy his mentor would understand. Imagine rowing a boat, Volkov said. They were meeting in Sokolov's office. February 1951. Snow was falling outside the window. Inside the office was cold despite the radiator that hissed and clanked but provided little actual heat. You row faster, the boat goes faster. Yes, Sokolov agreed. But what happens when you row so fast that the oar catches fire from friction with the water? Sokolov's eyes lit up with understanding. You cannot row faster. The fire destroys the oar. Exactly, propeller blades are the oars. Air is the water. As a propeller spins faster, the blade tips approach the speed of sound. And air behaves very differently as it approaches sonic velocity, creates shock waves, like fire on the ore. These shock waves destroy efficiency, tear the blade apart. So we are limited by physics. American engineers believe we are limited. They have built entire textbooks explaining why transonic propellers are impossible. They have designed their aircraft to work around this limitation. And you, Sokolov asked, though he already suspected the answer. Volkov pulled Andrei's letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully. The paper was so worn it threatened to tear along the creases. My brother died because we could not defend Leningrad from siege. I will not accept that physics prevents me from building engines that defend future children. I refuse to believe impossible means impossible. Volkov would spend the next 18 months attempting what American textbooks said could not be done, working 18-hour days in a freezing facility, testing blade after blade until they exploded. And he would succeed, but not through planning, through accident, through a manufacturing defect that improved performance, through discovering that sometimes mistakes teach better lessons than theory. That discovery was still months away. The facility where Volkov worked was called Design Bureau 51, a cluster of buildings on the outskirts of Moscow surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. Security was absolute. Everyone who entered was searched. Everyone who left was searched. Drawings could not leave the facility. Even scrap paper was collected and burned to prevent secrets from escaping. Inside, conditions were brutal. The buildings were cold in winter, sweltering in summer. Heating and ventilation systems were inadequate. Equipment was often improvised from whatever could be scavenged. Working hours stretched to the point where engineers slept at their desks rather than waste time going home. 2 o'clock in the morning, February 1952, nearly a year into the 5-year deadline. Volkov sat at his drafting table surrounded by calculations that refused to yield solutions. Around him, a dozen other engineers worked in silence, broken only by the scratch of pencils on paper and occasional frustrated curses. Boris Fedorov approached carrying 2 tin cups, age 32, Volkov's chief assistant, a man who had survived the siege of Stalingrad and brought that survivor's mentality to engineering challenges. If you could live through Stalingrad, you could solve any problem if you refused to quit. Dinner, Fedorov said, handing Volkov one of the cups. The cup contained tea, weak tea made from leaves that had been used 3 times already. Fedorov's other hand held 2 heels of black bread. The bread was stale, hard enough to break teeth if you bit carelessly. Standard Soviet engineering diet, fuel for minds that could not afford to stop working even for proper meals. Volkov accepted the tea and bread, chewed mechanically, barely tasting. His mind was still circling the propeller problem like a dog circling prey it could not quite reach. The Americans say it cannot be done, Fedorov said, chewing his own bread. Their textbooks prove that transonic propellers are impossible. Volkov looked up from his calculations. His eyes were red from fatigue and the poor lighting. His face was thinner than it had been a year ago. The work was consuming him physically even as it drove him forward mentally. The Americans wrote those textbooks assuming propellers must avoid the transonic region. What if we designed propellers to operate within it, to use the shock waves instead of avoiding them? That is insane. So was defeating Nazi Germany with T-34 tanks that German engineers said were inferior. We won by building 10 tanks for every one of theirs, by making them simple enough that conscripts could repair them with hammers and determination, by refusing to accept that German engineering was automatically better. Volkov pulled Andrei's letter from his pocket, read it for perhaps the 100th time that week. The words he had memorized but still needed to see written in his brother's hand. Andrei died so we could build engines that prevent future wars. I will not dishonor his death by accepting American limitations as if they were laws of nature. Fedorov nodded slowly. In the Soviet system, engineers worked not just from professional pride but from personal grief, from losses that demanded meaning, from deaths that required purpose. Understanding this was understanding why Soviet engineers sometimes achieved what Western experts thought impossible. Desperation focused the mind wonderfully. The tea was bitter. The bread tasted like sawdust, but they fueled work that would change the world. Some of you worked night shifts in factories, ate cold sandwiches at 2 a.m., drank coffee that tasted like motor oil. But you showed up, did the work. because the job mattered. That's what these Soviet engineers were doing. Not for communism, for survival, for the memory of the dead, for children's futures. Elena Volkova was 30 years old in 1952, a nurse at a Moscow hospital. She had met Dmitry in 1945 when the war ended and soldiers were flooding back from the front. Had married him in 1947, believing that peacetime would bring normal life, time together, maybe children. Instead, his work consumed him. She brought him meals at the design bureau because he forgot to eat, found him asleep at his drafting table because he forgot to go home, watched him grow thinner, more exhausted, more obsessed with the project that was slowly killing him. March 1952. She confronted him in their small apartment. 2 rooms that should have felt cozy, but instead felt empty because he was never there. You are killing yourself for engines that may never work. They will work. How do you know? Because Andrei's letter demands it. Because Stalin will kill us if they do not. Because America thinks we are backward peasants, and I will prove them wrong. Elena took his hands. They were stained with ink and oil, calloused from handling tools. The hands of a man who worked with both mind and body. I need you to survive this, Dmitry. Need you to come home. Not as an engineer, not as Stalin's servant, as my husband. Volkov pulled her close, made a promise he did not know if he could keep. When this is finished, I will request a peaceful assignment. We will start a family. We will have a normal life. It was a lie of kindness. They both knew it. Soviet engineers did not get peaceful assignments during the Cold War. But sometimes lies are all you have when truth is unbearable. Summer 1952. Test engine number 47. Volkov had been running variations of swept blade designs for 6 months, each test providing data, each failure teaching lessons. The process was methodical, scientific, change one variable at a time, document everything, build understanding brick by brick. This test should have been routine, same blade shape as the previous test, slightly modified alloy composition, expected results within normal parameters. Instead, at 17 minutes into the test run, something extraordinary happened. The engine suddenly began producing 20% more thrust than calculations predicted. Fuel consumption dropped. Vibration decreased. Every instrument reading improved simultaneously, as if the engine had suddenly decided to exceed its theoretical capabilities. Volkov could not believe the data, ordered immediate shutdown, had his team verify every instrument, check for calibration errors, run the test again to see if the results were reproducible. They ran the test again. Same results. The blade was working better than theory said was possible. Volkov examined the blade under magnification, searched for what had changed, found his answer in what should have been a failure. The metal's crystalline structure had formed incorrectly during the cooling process. A manufacturing defect, microscopic variations in surface texture that changed how air flowed over the blade at transonic speeds. The defect improved performance. For 3 days, Volkov did not sleep, did not eat except what Elena forced into his mouth when she visited the bureau. He analyzed that defect from every angle, ran calculations, built theoretical models, began to understand what had happened. The irregular surface was managing shockwave formation, creating patterns that improved efficiency instead of destroying it. The shockwaves that were supposed to be the enemy could be controlled, shaped. He had discovered it, the key to transonic propeller design. Not avoiding shockwaves, not fighting them, but managing their formation through precise control of blade geometry and surface texture. The impossible was becoming possible. October 1952, 15 months into the 5-year deadline. Volkov presented his complete engine design to Sokolov and a room full of senior engineers and Communist Party officials who would decide whether the project continued or ended. The DV-15, Dmitry Volkov, 15,000 horsepower. A designation that honored the designer and specified the power output, the most powerful turboprop engine ever conceived. Driving counter-rotating propellers with swept blades that operated efficiently in the transonic regime that American engineers swore was forbidden territory. Test day arrived November 12th, a cold morning, the kind of cold that made metal brittle and men's breath hang like fog in the still air. Sokolov watched from the control room at Baikonur Flight Test Facility. Maria stood beside him, the first time she had attended a test. But this one felt different. This one would determine whether Victor came home or went back to the gulag. Volkov was in the test cell with his creation, wearing headphones connected to the control room. His hands were steady on the controls despite the exhaustion and fear churning in his gut. This was the moment. Everything depended on the next 30 minutes. Beginning test sequence, he said. His voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the terror he felt. The turbine began spinning. Slowly at first, a whine building in pitch as rotation speed increased. Then faster. The propellers started turning, gaining speed. The distinctive counter-rotation creating visual patterns that seemed to defy physics. Two sets of blades spinning in opposite directions on the same shaft. A complexity that American engineers had abandoned as too difficult. The instruments showed normal readings, temperature climbing as expected, pressure building within parameters, vibration within acceptable limits. Volkov increased power, 50%, 75%. The whine became a roar. Then the roar became something beyond sound, a physical presence that shook the test cell, that made the control room windows vibrate, that could be felt in bones, in chest, in the base of the skull. 100% power. The engine produced 15,000 horsepower exactly as designed. Fuel consumption matched predictions. Propeller efficiency exceeded calculations by 8%. The shock waves that should have torn the blade apart were instead creating thrust patterns that American theory said could not exist. In the control room, Sokolov watched the instruments in silence. His hands gripped the edge of the console so hard his knuckles were white. Maria stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder. She was crying silently. Tears of relief or fear or hope, maybe all three. Sustained full power test, Volkov announced, maintaining for 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. Everyone in the facility held their breath, waiting for catastrophic failure, waiting for the explosion that would destroy 3 years of work and condemn them all. The test cell was designed to contain such explosions. But knowledge of safety features did not make the wait easier. The engine ran smoothly, temperature stable, no vibration spikes. No unusual noises beyond the steady roar of the most powerful turboprop engine in the world, proving that the impossible could become real. At exactly 15 minutes, Volkov reduced power, shut down the turbine, let the propellers coast to stop. The silence that followed was almost painful after the sustained roar. Then Volkov's voice over the headphones, shaking now, professional composure finally breaking under the weight of relief. Test successful. All parameters exceeded expectations. The DV-15 works. Sokolov sagged in his chair. Maria openly crying now. Engineers in the control room were cheering, hugging each other, some crying too. Men who had worked 20-hour days for 18 months, who had sacrificed health and family and sanity for this moment. In the corner taking notes furiously was Alexei Karpov, the informant, writing his report for the NKVD, documenting success but also searching for anything that could be used against Sokolov later. Because in Stalin's Soviet Union, success was never guaranteed to bring safety. Sometimes it just made you a more valuable target. But none of them knew about Karpov yet. In that moment, they were just engineers who had achieved the impossible, who had proved that determination and desperation could sometimes exceed what comfort and resources could accomplish. Some of you worked on projects where failure meant more than professional embarrassment, where lives depended on getting it right. You understand that moment when the test succeeds and relief washes over you like a wave. That's what these men felt. Not politics, not ideology, just engineers celebrating that their work, their sacrifices mattered. The engine worked. But building an aircraft around it would require 3 more years of brutal development, would require test flights that nearly killed the Soviet Union's best pilot, would force one man to make a 7-minute decision between ejecting to save his life or landing to save the program that had consumed 3 years of hundreds of lives. And that decision made in 7 minutes while flying a damaged aircraft would ultimately produce the bomber that changed the strategic balance between superpowers forever. The man chosen to fly that first test was Mikhail Petrov, age 43 in 1952, a decorated test pilot with a career spanning 2 decades, A man who had survived a dozen prototype crashes through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of calm under pressure that cannot be taught. Petrov had flown the first prototype of the Soviet copy of the B-29, the bomber that Americans built to win the war in the Pacific. The aircraft that Stalin had demanded Soviet engineers replicate down to the smallest rivet after 3 examples landed in Siberia during the war. Petrov had taken that first Soviet copy into the air knowing it might kill him. Knowing that reverse engineering might have missed some critical detail. Knowing that American engineering and Soviet manufacturing were not the same thing. He had survived engine fires that filled the cockpit with smoke, structural failures that made the airframe shudder like a dying animal, control malfunctions that required flying the aircraft with brute strength when hydraulics failed, had survived crashes that should have killed him but did not because he was too stubborn or too skilled or too lucky to die. He was the obvious choice for the most dangerous assignment, first flight of the largest, most powerful propeller aircraft ever built. But Mikhail Petrov was not just a test pilot. He was also a husband, a father, a man who came home between test flights to an apartment near Baikonur where his family waited. His wife Katya was 41 years old. They had married young during the war when tomorrow was never guaranteed, and you seized happiness where you could find it. She had given birth to their first son while Petrov was flying combat missions, had raised that son alone for 2 years before Petrov returned from the front. Their sons were 15 and 12 now, old enough to understand that their father's work was dangerous, old enough to feel pride mixed with fear when they heard engine tests shaking the ground, close enough to the airfield that they could see bombers take off and land and imagine their father in the cockpit making life and death decisions. Many of you were fathers who worked dangerous jobs, maybe flew aircraft, maybe worked in factories with heavy machinery, and you came home every night to families who worried, who asked you to quit, who needed you to stay alive. But you did the work because somebody had to, because providing for your family meant more than playing it safe. You understand, Petrov. The morning of November 12th, 1952, the same day as the successful engine test, Bear Prototype 1 sat on the runway fueled and ready. Petrov would fly it into the sky or die trying. There was no middle ground with test flights. You succeeded or you failed. You lived or you died. Katya woke before dawn, made breakfast in their small kitchen, made it with the kind of care that said, this is love expressed through food. This is home. This is what you return to. This is why you survive. Blini, Russian pancakes. She had started making the batter the night before. Letting it rest overnight made the pancakes lighter, more tender. She cooked them in the pan that had belonged to her grandmother, watched them bubble and brown, flipped them at exactly the right moment. The sour cream was fresh, thick and tangy. The berry jam she had made last summer from berries their sons picked in the woods outside Baikonur. Blackberries. The jam was deep purple, sweet with just enough tartness to balance the richness of the cream and pancakes. Strong tea with lemon. The tea was better quality than what most Soviet families could afford, a benefit of Petrov's position. Lemon was precious, hard to find. She used it anyway because this breakfast mattered more than saving luxuries for later. Black bread with butter. The bread was dense and dark, made from rye flour. The butter was pale yellow. Real butter, not the margarine substitutes that many families used. The family ate together in the kitchen. Morning sunlight came through the window. Outside, the steppes stretched to the horizon, flat land that seemed to go on forever, beautiful in its emptiness. The younger son ate with enthusiasm, his mouth full of blini, talking between bites the way 12-year-old boys do. Will it fly, Papa? Will it really fly? Petrov looked at his son, saw excitement without understanding of danger. The childhood innocence that believed fathers were invincible, that heroes from stories and fathers who flew airplanes were the same thing. Of course it will fly, Petrov said. His voice was confident, projecting certainty he did not entirely feel. Your papa has never crashed an airplane he could not walk away from. Not strictly true. He had ejected twice when aircraft exploded in midair, had burns scarring his back that his sons had never seen, had nightmares that still woke him some nights, dreams of falling, of fire, of metal tearing and ground rushing up too fast. But children did not need to know that courage and fear coexist in every test pilot's heart, that a calm voice and steady hands concealed calculations of risk, improbability, and acceptable losses. The older son was quieter, 15 years old enough to understand more than his brother, old enough to have heard stories about test pilots who did not come home. He ate his blinis slowly, watched his father with eyes that asked questions he did not voice. Katya said nothing, just poured more tea, made sure everyone had enough to eat, played her role in the ritual that said this is normal. This is just another day, nothing to fear. But her hands shook slightly when she refilled Petrov's cup. He noticed, said nothing, just caught her eye and held her gaze for a moment. A wordless conversation between two people who had lived through war and loss and knew some things could not be spoken aloud. She packed him lunch after breakfast. More blini wrapped in clean cloth, hard cheese, an apple, a water bottle. He would not eat it. Test pilots never ate before dangerous flights. An empty stomach meant less mess if ejection was required. Less chance of choking if you had to breathe pure oxygen at high altitude. But he took the lunch anyway, because taking it meant coming home to return the empty container. Meant survival, meant promises kept. Come home, Katya whispered when the sons were gathering their school books, when she could speak without them hearing. Whatever happens up there, whatever goes wrong, come home. Petrov kissed her, tasted the salt from tears she would not let their son see, made the promise he had made many times before, the promise that became harder to believe each time he made it. I always come home. The blini had tasted perfect, sweet jam mixing with tangy sour cream, savory pancakes that their grandmother had taught Katya to make, the flavor of home and family and normal life that existed outside the dangerous work of testing aircraft that pushed beyond known limits. He would remember that taste 3 hours later when the propeller blade cracked and he had 7 minutes to decide whether he would ever taste it again. How many of you remember last meals before dangerous missions, before shipping out, before flights you weren't sure you'd come back from? You remember every bite, every flavor, because you didn't know if that meal might be the last normal thing you experienced. That's what Petrov was feeling, and that's what made him fight so hard to survive. Not glory, not duty, just wanting to come home to family and taste his wife's cooking one more time. November 12, 1952, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Bear Prototype 1 lined up on the runway at Baikonur. The aircraft was enormous, larger than any bomber the Soviet Union had ever built. Wings swept back at angles that looked wrong to eyes trained on conventional aircraft. 4 massive engines, each one housing Volkov's DV-15 turbine, driving those impossible counter-rotating propellers. Sokolov watched from the control tower. Volkov stood beside him. Maria in the observation area. Every engineer who had worked on the program. Every bureaucrat who had approved funding. Everyone whose career depended on this flight succeeding. At the fence line, Katya stood with her sons. She had not planned to come. Had thought she would stay home, wait for the phone call telling her whether she was still married or newly widowed. But at the last moment, she could not bear not knowing. Had to see it herself. Had to watch him fly or fall. Petrov ran through the pre-flight checklist, each item methodical, systematic, the ritual that transformed fear into procedure, fuel quantity, control surfaces, engine instruments, hydraulic pressure, everything by the book, everything exactly as it should be. He advanced the throttles. All 4 engines came to life simultaneously, a roar unlike anything heard before, deeper than conventional aircraft, a thrumming that shook the ground and made the control tower windows vibrate in their frames, the counter-rotating propellers creating visual patterns that hurt to watch. 8 massive blades per engine, 32 blades total spinning at speeds that pushed the laws of physics. The aircraft began rolling, slowly at first, then faster, using nearly the entire length of the extended runway. For several heart-stopping seconds, it seemed to hang on the edge of stall, the engine screaming at maximum power, the wings straining to generate enough lift to raise 170 tons of metal into air. Then the nose tilted upward. The wheels left the ground. The massive aircraft climbed, slowly, painfully, but climbing. In the control tower, Sokolov allowed himself to breathe. Volkov was shaking, his hands gripping the console, watching his engines perform exactly as designed, watching theory become reality. At the fence line, Katya held her sons while they cheered. Watched the aircraft climb into the clear November sky. Watched her husband do what he had done 100 times before. Felt her heart slowly unclench. The bear was flying. Many of you watching this flew an aircraft during the 1950s and 60s, either military or commercial. You understand what these engineers just accomplished. The precision required, the courage to test unproven technology. That was your generation's contribution to history. If you or your family members worked in aviation during this era, share your stories in the comments below. These memories matter. They're part of American history, part of world history, and we want to preserve them. For 23 minutes, everything was perfect. Petrov climbed to 3,000 meters, tested control responses. The aircraft handled better than expected, more responsive than something this large had any right to be. The engines ran smoothly, temperature and pressure within normal limits, fuel consumption matching predictions. He was beginning to believe this might be a routine test flight, that months of preparation and calculation had actually worked, that they had solved an impossible problem without paying the price in blood and twisted metal. Then a warning light, engine 2, vibration spike. Petrov's eyes went to the instrument panel. Engine 2, temperature normal, pressure normal. But the vibration was there, subtle at first, like a tremor you might imagine, but growing stronger with each passing second. Control, I have vibration anomaly engine 2, reducing power to investigate. Sokolov's voice came back tight with tension. Copy, can you maintain flight? Affirmative, vibration within acceptable range. Continuing, test profile. But 10 minutes later, the vibration increased. No longer subtle, now visible in the cockpit. The controls shaking in his hands. The instruments becoming hard to read through the vibration. Petrov made the decision. Control terminating test. Returning to base. Professional. Calm. Giving no indication of the alarm bells ringing in his head. The calculations running. The risk assessment happening faster than conscious thought. Then a bang. Loud. Metallic. The sound of something breaking under stress. The sound every pilot fears. The sound that means catastrophic failure. Engine 2 surged, the turbine screaming as damaged components spun out of balance, then died completely. The fire warning light blazed red on the panel, smoke trailing from the nacelle visible through the cockpit window. Petrov's hands moved automatically, training overriding fear. Fire suppression activated, dead engine feathered to reduce drag. Fuel shut off. The smoke stopped, but the vibration in engine 3 increased dramatically. Control, I have lost engine 2. Propeller damage suspected. Experiencing severe vibration on engine 3. Request emergency landing clearance. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The propeller blade on engine 2 had cracked. A stress fracture where theory said the blade was strongest. Fragments from the failing blade had struck engine 3's propeller assembly. 2 engines damaged. 2 engines still functioning, but now carrying the load meant for 4. And Petrov had 7 minutes of fuel at current consumption rate to decide what to do. 7 minutes to choose between ejecting to save his life or attempting a landing that might kill him, but would save 3 years of work. 7 minutes to decide whether he was a test pilot or a husband, whether duty mattered more than promises made over a blini breakfast. Remember earlier when we asked if the aircraft would fly? The answer was yes. But the question should have been, will it land? Because in the next 7 minutes, Petrov would make a decision that defined his entire career, defined his life, defined whether his sons would remember a father who came home or a father who died for an engineering program. That decision was coming now. In the control tower, engineers were shouting, voices overlapping, some demanding immediate ejection order. Save the pilot. Let the aircraft crash in a remote area where it would hurt no one. Others arguing the aircraft could be saved. It represented too much investment, too much work, too much hope. Sokolov raised his hand. The shouting stopped. Everyone looked at him. The man who had survived the Gulag, who understood what failure of this program would mean. Petrov, Sokolov said. His voice was calm despite the fear eating at his gut. What is your assessment? Can you land? The question every test pilot dreads. Because the wrong answer means death, your death. And you have seconds to decide based on incomplete information and gut feeling and 20 years of experience that might not be enough. Petrov looked at the instruments through vibration that made the needles blur, felt the aircraft through his hands on the controls, through his feet on the rudder pedals, through the seat pressing against his back. The aircraft was wounded but not dead, still responding to inputs, still flying. He thought about Katya, about sons cheering at the fence line, about blini breakfast and promises to come home, about life versus duty. He thought about Sokolov, about 6 years in the gulag, about what would happen if this aircraft crashed and the program failed, about all the engineers who had worked themselves to exhaustion for 18 months. He thought about Volkov, about the brother's letter carried for 10 years, about engines built to prevent future wars, about whether dying for an engineering program was waste or sacrifice. I can land her, Petrov said finally, each word a commitment, each word sealing his fate one way or another. But I need everyone off the runway, fire crews standing by. If I miscalculate, the crash will be spectacular. Understood. You are cleared for emergency approach. Good luck, Mikhail. At the fence line, Katya watched the crippled bomber approach, saw smoke trailing from the damaged engines, saw the asymmetric propeller rotation. One engine completely stopped, another vibrating so badly she could see it from the ground. She knew something was desperately wrong. The sons were asking questions. Why is it smoking? Why is Papa coming back so soon? Is everything okay? She had no answers, just gripped the fence with both hands so hard the wire cut into her palms. Watched, prayed to a God she was not supposed to believe in, bargained with fate. Take anything, take everything, just bring him home. Petrov lined up the approach. The aircraft wanted to turn toward the dead engines, asymmetric thrust trying to spin the aircraft into an uncontrolled roll. He compensated with rudder and aileron, pushing the controls hard, burning fuel with every second, watching altitude decrease. The runway seemed impossibly short, the damaged engines vibrating worse. Any moment the propeller blade on engine 3 could separate completely. If that happened, the unbalanced engine would tear itself from the wing. The aircraft would flip, would crash, would explode in a fireball, leaving nothing but scattered debris and the memory of a test pilot who flew too close to the edge. Petrov held steady, ignored the vibration trying to shake his teeth loose, ignored the fear screaming at him to eject while he still could, focused on one thing and one thing only, keeping the wings level. The ground rushing up, too fast or too slow. Hard to tell through the vibration and smoke and adrenaline making time behave strangely. He crossed the runway threshold at exactly the correct altitude. Not too high, not too low. Perfect despite everything going wrong. He pulled power on the good engines. Let the damaged ones windmill. The massive bomber settled toward concrete, 170 tons of metal and fuel and shattered dreams falling toward Earth at a controlled rate. The main wheels touched, firm but controlled. Not graceful, but good enough. The nose wheel came down. Petrov activated reverse thrust on the good engines. Full power, maximum braking. The bear slowed, eating runway, closer and closer to the end, where concrete gave way to step, where grass and dirt waited to catch an aircraft that could not stop in time. She slowed more, stopped with 50 meters of runway remaining. Did not explode. Petrov shut down all systems, sat in silence, his hands shaking now, the adrenaline crash setting in, the calm that had sustained him through the crisis draining away, leaving only exhaustion and delayed fear. He had just landed 170 tons of aircraft with half its engines damaged, had bet his life that his skill was sufficient, had wagered everything on calculations made in seconds while vibration tried to shake the aircraft apart. He had won the bet. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft. Fire trucks surrounded it, foam spraying just in case. Sokolov and Volkov running across the tarmac. Katya broke through the fence line. Security tried to stop her, but she was unstoppable. A mother bear protecting family. A wife who had watched her husband nearly die and would not be denied. Petrov climbed out of the cockpit, stood on the wing, his legs unsteady. Katya was there. She hit him, once, hard, an open palm across his face. then pulled him close, held him so tight he could barely breathe. Don't ever do that again. I promised to come home. You could have ejected, could have saved yourself. And lost 3 years of work, Sokolov would be sent back to the Gulag. Volkov would be shot. Everyone who worked on this program would be punished. I had to land her. Volkov reached them, looked at the damaged engines. The propeller blade on engine 2 had cracked at 70% span. Exactly where calculations said it was strongest. A manufacturing defect, a stress concentration from the crystalline structure that had given them their breakthrough. My fault, Volkov said quietly, his voice carrying shame and exhaustion. My design, my failure. Petrov gripped his shoulder, his hand still shaking but his voice steady. Your design just survived a test that would have destroyed any American aircraft. The crack is fixable. The engines proved themselves. We learned what we needed to learn. Sokolov arrived, looked at the damage, looked at Petrov, looked at the team gathered around the wounded aircraft. Saw 3 years of work that had almost ended in fire and death. Saw success built on the edge of disaster. 2 weeks to repair, Sokolov said. Not a question, a statement, a declaration of intent. Fix the metallurgy problem, strengthen the blade design, then we fly again. How many of you made decisions like Petrov's chose mission over safety duty over fear? Maybe not flying damaged aircraft, but the same calculation, the same weighing of risks, the same understanding that somebody had to do dangerous work. You understand why he landed instead of ejecting. Not because he was a hero, because he was a professional. And that's what professionals do. They do the job even when scared, especially when scared. The crack was fixed. A new alloy developed, stronger, more resistant to fatigue. But Mikhail Petrov would fly every test flight for the next 3 years, would risk death dozens more times, would survive through skill and determination and luck that could not last forever. But before the Bear became operational, something unexpected happened. Stalin died, March 1953. Heart attack, or poison, or both. The official story changed depending on who was telling it. What mattered, the terror-driving development eased slightly. Nikita Khrushchev took power. A different man, different pressures. He still needed the bomber, but the motivation shifted from pure terror to strategic necessity. In the shuffle that followed Stalin's death, the informant Karpov was arrested, revealed as Beria's agent. Beria himself was executed in the power struggle. Karpov was shot shortly after. Sokolov learned about the informant only after the man was dead, realized how close he had come to a second arrest. That night, Maria burned the sealed letter. It was no longer needed. Her husband had survived. The project would succeed. The terror that had driven them for 2 years was easing. Not gone. Never truly gone in the Soviet system, but easing enough to breathe. By 1955, the Bear was operational. Production models rolling from factories. First squadron assigned to the Strategic Bomber Force, capable of reaching America, carrying hydrogen bombs, returning home. The strategic balance had shifted, and American intelligence was only beginning to understand how catastrophically they had underestimated Soviet capabilities. November 1958, 6 years after the Bear's first flight, Technical Sergeant David Chen sat at a radar console at Loring Air Force Base, Maine. Age 26, Chinese-American. His parents ran a laundry in San Francisco. David had joined the Air Force to prove his loyalty, to show he was American despite a face that made some people question. He watched the radar screen as a contact approached from the north, tracking speed and altitude. Numbers that did not make sense. Sir Chen called to his supervisor, Captain James O'Reilly. Contact moving 520 knots at 8,000 meters. Probable Bear bomber. O'Reilly walked over, looked at the screen, frowned. 520. Check your equipment, Sergeant. Soviet propeller planes can't go that fast. Must be instrument error. Sir, reading consistent across all 3 sensors. Rangefinder confirms speed. This isn't a malfunction. Sergeant Chen, I've been tracking Soviet aircraft for 12 years. Propeller bombers don't exceed 400 knots, period. They're physically limited by blade tip speeds. You need to recalibrate. Chen wanted to argue, wanted to point to the data, to numbers that were clear and consistent. But arguing with a superior officer was career suicide, especially for a Chinese American trying to prove he belonged. Yes, sir. I'll recalibrate. He recalibrated. The contact still showed 520 knots. He filed a report documenting the actual speed, added a note about consistent readings across multiple sensors. The report was classified, filed, ignored, because accepting that Soviet propeller aircraft matched jet speeds meant accepting that American intelligence estimates were wrong, that technological assumptions were wrong, that comfortable beliefs about American superiority were wrong. It was easier to believe in equipment malfunction than confront uncomfortable truth. Some of you worked in the military, know what it's like to file reports that nobody wants to hear, to have evidence dismissed because it contradicts what commanders want to believe. Chen did his job, documented the truth. The system ignored him, not because he was wrong, because the system wasn't ready to hear he was right. Chen remembered this incident 5 years later when he left the Air Force, became an electrical engineer, worked on radar systems that believed their measurements instead of dismissing data that contradicted expectations. While radar operators like Chen documented impossible speeds and were told their equipment was broken, the CIA struggled to understand the bear's true capabilities. Nevada Desert, 1955. Dr. Robert Harrison at Desert Ridge Analysis Center received the first clear bear photographs, taken by a U-2 spy plane at 70,000 feet over a Kazakhstan airfield. The images were grainy, indistinct, the aircraft appearing as a vague shape against the concrete runway, but enough to trigger alarm. Harrison studied the photos for weeks, made calculations based on visible dimensions, estimated performance using American propeller theory, the theory he had taught for 2 decades. The theory published in textbooks bearing his name. His conclusion: maximum speed approximately 350 miles per hour. Fast for a propeller aircraft, but not a threat to American air defenses equipped with jet interceptors. He was catastrophically wrong, but he would not discover that for 5 more years. Would not understand how wrong until a Norwegian beach crash gave him an actual blade to examine. Would not understand his own role in American failure until he found his own memo dismissing the Soviet breakthrough. That discovery was coming, but not yet. August 1959. A Soviet engineer working at Design Bureau 51 defected to the West. Name Igor Vasilyev, age 41. He had worked under Volkov for 6 years. Left because he saw what the Soviet system did to brilliant men like Volkov. Watched them work until their health broke, until marriages collapsed, until nothing remained except work and memory of dead brothers and promises that could never be fulfilled. Vasilyev crossed the Finnish border on foot, requested asylum, brought no documents, no drawings, just memories. Sketches made after his escape, performance figures memorized during 6 years, watching impossible propellers being tested. The CIA debriefed him for 3 months. Safe house outside Munich. A team of engineers questioning every claim, every specification, every detail of swept, blade design and counter-rotating propellers and transonic operation that American theory said was forbidden. Harrison interviewed Vasilyev personally, December 1959, 6 months after the defection. You're telling me these propellers operate with blade tip speeds exceeding Mach 0.9? Yes, Mach 0.93 cruise, 0.97 maximum continuous. Americans say impossible, but Volkov made it work. That should create shock waves, destroying efficiency. It does create shock waves, but the blade geometry manages their formation, uses them to improve thrust instead of destroying it. Volkov refused to accept the transonic region as forbidden, tested hundreds of shapes, found one that worked through systematic experimentation, not theory, then developed theory explaining why it worked. Harrison felt his entire understanding of propeller aerodynamics crumbling. The American approach is theory first, then design. The Soviet approach was desperation first, then experimentation, then theory. When you face death if you fail, you try things that American engineers dismiss as impossible. Sometimes those impossible things work. Vasilyev pulled out a notebook. Rough sketches, equations, fragments of design philosophy recorded after his escape. Harrison studied the sketches, saw blade shapes that violated every principle, saw equations describing shockwave management he had never considered, saw the possibility that everything he had taught might be incomplete. He transmitted Vasiliev's information to Washington, recommended an urgent program to replicate the Soviet breakthrough, warned that the bear posed a greater threat than estimates suggested. The response came 2 weeks later. Budget constraints, no funding available. Analysis suggested Vasiliev was exaggerating to increase his asylum value. Recommendation declined. Harrison understood then how dangerous American arrogance had become. Not just technological arrogance, institutional arrogance. The arrogance that dismissed evidence because accepting it would require admitting mistakes. He filed the report in classified archives, returned to work analyzing other Soviet developments. But Vasiliev's sketches stayed with him. Questions gnawed at the comfortable certainty he had carried for 2 decades. Remember when we asked how Soviet engineers achieved the impossible? Vasiliev gave. Part of the answer: desperation drove innovation that American comfort prevented. But the complete answer would require physical evidence. Would require an actual blade recovered from a crashed aircraft. That evidence was coming. In 2 months, on a Norwegian beach. And it would destroy Harrison's comfortable certainty forever. July 1st, 1960, a Soviet bear on routine patrol over the Barents Sea, frigid waters between Norway and the Soviet Arctic coast. These patrols had become common by 1960. Soviet bombers probing NATO airspace, testing radar coverage, demonstrating capability, reminding the West that the strategic balance had shifted. The aircraft was 12 hours into its mission when Engine 3 suffered catastrophic failure. The exact cause would never be determined. Turbine blade failure, maybe metal fatigue, maybe a manufacturing defect, maybe just bad luck. The result was clear: the engine exploded, shrapnel tore through the wing, destroyed a fuel tank. The fire suppression system activated, but the damage was severe. Major Konstantin Ivanov, age 38, a pilot with 14 years' experience, reacted instantly. Feathered the damaged engine, cut fuel supply, ordered his crew to jettison non-essential equipment to reduce weight, turned toward the nearest land, the Norway coast. For 2 hours, Ivanov nursed the crippled bomber westward on 3 engines, fuel leaking from the damaged tank. Every minute brought them closer to Norwegian territory. Every minute brought Soviet naval vessels racing to intercept. But the ships were too far away, too slow. Ivanov's navigator calculated they would reach the Norwegian coast with perhaps 10 minutes of fuel remaining. Not enough to search for a suitable landing area. They would have one chance, one beach, one attempt. "Prepare for emergency landing," Ivanov announced. "This will be rough." The crew strapped in, braced for impact, said prayers to a god they were not supposed to believe in. Eric Hansen, age 56, a fisherman from the village of Vardo, was checking his nets when he saw the damaged Soviet bomber approaching. Flying low, trailing smoke, the engines making a sound that even a non-pilot recognizes wrong. He watched the aircraft line up with the beach half a mile from his boat, watched it come in too fast and too steep, watched the landing gear deploy, watched the massive bomber hit sand with an impact that sent spray flying hundreds of meters. The aircraft skidded across the beach, breaking in 2 places, wings crumpling, but the fuselage remained largely intact. No fire, no explosion, just a wounded aircraft coming to rest on frozen Norwegian sand. Hansen rowed to shore, ran across the beach toward the wreckage, saw the Russian crew climbing from the broken aircraft. 7 men, dazed, injured, one with a broken arm, another bleeding from a head wound, but alive. Hansen spoke no Russian. They spoke no Norwegian. But injury transcends language. Pain is recognizable in any tongue. He helped them. Medical kit from his boat, bandaged wounds, offered water, gave a blanket to the pilot shivering from shock. Major Ivanov looked at the Norwegian fishermen helping an enemy crew, felt shame and gratitude competing. The opposite of propaganda. Americans and their allies were supposed to be cruel imperialists. This man was just a fisherman helping injured people. "Thank you," Ivanov said in the broken English, the only words they shared. Hansen nodded. "War is politics. People are people. You need help, I give help." This interaction would haunt Ivanov for the rest of his life, make him question certainties, Plant seeds that decades later would bloom into different understanding. But that was the future. In that moment on a frozen Norwegian beach, Hansen just did what seemed right. Some of you served overseas, met enemy soldiers who turned out to be just men, not monsters, not propaganda, just men doing jobs, scared, far from home. Human. Hansen understood that. You understand that. Politics divides people. Humanity connects them. Within hours, an American transport aircraft was en route to Norway. Intelligence officers with priority equipment lists. Norwegian authorities secured the crash site, posted guards, waited for instructions. Soviet naval vessels were visible on the horizon, racing to reach the crash site, racing to recover the aircraft before NATO could examine it, racing against time and distance and diplomatic complications. The American team arrived first, by 15 minutes. 15 minutes separating the greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War from complete failure. They worked frantically, loaded propeller blades from the damaged engine onto trucks, photographed everything, collected fragments, worked until Soviet ships were entering the harbor and the diplomatic situation became impossible. The American aircraft took off as Soviet sailors came ashore. Close enough to see each other, close enough to understand both sides wanted the same thing, but the Americans had it. By 15 minutes, the propeller blades arrived at Desert Ridge Analysis Center 3 days later. July 4th, 1960, Independence Day, a fitting date for a discovery that would challenge American independence from uncomfortable truths. Robert Harrison's comfortable understanding of aerodynamics was about to be destroyed. Harrison stood in the frozen hangar, looking at the blade that should not exist. He had been so confident. Soviet engineers were competent at copying, but not innovation. Every intelligence estimate said so. Every American expert believed it. His own calculations supported it. The blade proved them all wrong. The first week was just measuring. Every dimension, every curve, every thickness variation. Mitchell running metallurgical analysis. Sanders coordinating with agencies searching for Soviet design methodology information. Nothing made sense. The blade geometry contradicted every principle Harrison had taught for 2 decades. The alloy composition included elements American metallurgists had never considered for propeller applications. The manufacturing precision rivaled anything American industry could produce. After 2 weeks, Harrison called a team meeting. Mitchell and Sanders gathering around the conference table. Director Crawford watching from the doorway. "Gentlemen," Harrison began. His voice was careful. "I need to say something uncomfortable. This propeller represents a level of sophistication we did not believe Soviets were capable of achieving. Our intelligence estimates were wrong. Our assumptions about Soviet technological capabilities were wrong." He paused. The next words were the hardest he had ever spoken. "I was wrong." Mitchell looked up. "What are you saying, Bob?" "I'm saying we need to completely reassess Soviet engineering capabilities. This is not a lucky accident. This is systematic innovation based on advanced theoretical understanding we apparently don't possess." Sanders was uncomfortable. "If you publish that assessment, it causes panic. The American public believes we have technological superiority, believes we're safe behind air defenses designed for slower bombers. The American public is entitled to truth, not comfortable lies. If Soviet bombers fly faster than our estimates, our air defenses are inadequate. Better we know now than discover during an actual attack when millions are dying." Harrison returned to analyzing the blade. 3 months of work ahead, 20-hour days. Slowly understanding how the Soviets had achieved the impossible, and slowly approaching a discovery that would shame him more than any professional failure. A discovery about his own past, about his own arrogance, about a memo he wrote in 1949 dismissing the Soviet breakthrough as impractical theory. That discovery was coming in 6 weeks, when he found translation files in classified archives. Harrison was about to learn that the Soviets didn't hide their breakthrough. They published it, shared mathematics revolutionizing propeller design with the world. And American experts, including Harrison himself, dismissed those papers. Not because the papers were wrong, but because accepting Soviet innovation meant admitting American theory was incomplete. That admission was coming, and it would cost Harrison everything he thought he knew about himself. Before we see Harrison's Pentagon briefing, understand what was at stake for him personally. Night before the briefing, April 1961, 9 months after the Norway crash, Harrison sat at his kitchen table in suburban Boston, his wife Elizabeth making tea. Three children supposedly in bed, but the oldest daughter, 14, appeared in the doorway. "Dad, I can't sleep. Too much homework." A lie. She wanted to talk. Wanted to understand why her father was working until midnight every night for 9 months. Why he looked older, thinner. Why he muttered equations in his sleep. "Come here, sweetheart." Harrison gestured to a chair. She sat. Elizabeth poured her tea too. Weak tea, not coffee. Still a child despite growing up in the shadow of nuclear threat. "What are you working on, Dad?" "Can't tell you specifics. It's classified. But I'm trying to understand how Soviet bombers work, how they built something we didn't think was possible." His daughter was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tomorrow when you tell the Pentagon what you learned, will you lose your job?" Harrison blinked. How did she know about the briefing? Then realized teenagers overheard everything, especially things parents thought they hid. Maybe, yes, probably. Then why tell them? Why not just say the Soviets got lucky? Why admit we were wrong? Some of you had children who asked impossible questions like this. Who saw through adult lies? Who forced you to articulate values you took for granted? Who made you explain why doing the right thing mattered more than safety? Harrison's daughter was asking the same question your children might have asked. Why do the right thing when the wrong thing is easier? Harrison looked at his daughter, at his wife, at the home they had built together, at the life that might fall apart after tomorrow's briefing. Because those Soviet bombers can reach us here, can destroy this house, this neighborhood, this city. And if I lie about their capabilities to protect my career, I'm leaving you vulnerable. I'm choosing my comfort over your safety. That's not what fathers do. His daughter's eyes teared up. But if you tell the truth and they fire you, then I find another job, but you stay alive. That's the trade I'll make every time. Elizabeth touched his shoulder. Squeezed gently, support without words. His daughter stood, hugged him, whispered, "Mom says you're the bravest man she knows. I think she's right." She went back to bed. Harrison sat at the kitchen table until dawn, rehearsing the briefing, knowing his career was probably ending tomorrow, knowing it was the right choice anyway. Because some truths are more important than comfort, some duties more important than career. Some moments require courage to speak uncomfortable words. April 1961, 3 months into the analysis. Harrison going through old translation files and classified archives, looking for Soviet technical papers explaining propeller design methodology. He found a folder, Soviet Aerodynamics Translations, 1948 to 1949, low priority. Inside translations from Journal of Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, Moscow. Published 1948. Mathematical Techniques Predicting Transonic Flow Patterns. Approaches to Managing Shockwave Formation. Methods for Designing Propellers Operating Efficiently in the Regime. American Doctrine Avoided. The papers described everything Harrison was discovering through physical blade analysis. Everything he thought was a secret Soviet breakthrough had been published openly 13 years earlier. Attached to the translations, a review memo, written 1949, recommending against further study. The reviewer's signature, R. Harrison. Harrison sat in the archive room, holding the memo, evidence of his own arrogance staring back from a page he had typed 12 years earlier. His words, mathematical techniques described are unfamiliar, and conclusions contradict established practice. No practical application is evident. Given resource constraints, recommend against further analysis of these theoretical papers. Soviet aerodynamic research traditionally lags American developments by substantial margin. These papers likely represent academic exercises rather than viable engineering methodologies. The Soviets didn't hide their breakthrough, they shared it with the world. Harrison had dismissed them, not because the papers were wrong, because accepting Soviet innovation meant admitting American theory was incomplete, meant admitting the possibility that enemy engineers could innovate where American engineers accepted limitations. Pride had blinded him. Comfortable assumptions prevented him from seeing truth that was literally handed to him in translation. That pride had cost America a decade of development. left American air defenses vulnerable, put millions of Americans, including his own children, at risk. How many of you ever discovered you were wrong about something important? Not a small mistake, a big mistake, a mistake with consequences. You remember that feeling, shame mixed with realization, understanding that your assumptions hurt people you were supposed to protect. That's what Harrison felt, holding his own memo, evidence of his failure. He photocopied the memo, included it in his Pentagon briefing materials. Evidence he would use against himself. Proof that American intelligence failure had a name, and that name was his. Harrison's humility, his willingness to admit American experts were wrong, represents the best of American values. Not arrogance about always being first, but courage to learn from anyone anywhere. Courage to admit when we're wrong. That's what makes America truly exceptional. If you believe that's what makes America great, not power but truth, leave a comment below. And if you remember the Cold War, if you lived through decades when nuclear wars seemed inevitable, tell us what traditional American values helped you through that fear. Your perspective matters. Your generation's wisdom matters. Share it with us. May 1961, Harrison stood before a room full of generals and admirals. Pentagon briefing room, wood paneling, American flags, portraits of past secretaries of defense watching from the walls. His report lay on the table before each officer. 400 pages documenting American intelligence failure, documenting his personal failure, documenting a decade of missed warnings and dismissed evidence. Admiral Richard Burke, age 59, Chief of Naval Operations, spoke first. World War II destroyer commander, a man who had fought the Japanese in the Pacific, who understood the cost of underestimating the enemy. Dr. Harrison, your report suggests Soviet propeller technology is a decade ahead of ours. That contradicts every intelligence assessment, every expert opinion. How certain are you of these conclusions? Harrison opened his folder, pulled out physical evidence, photographs of the blade, metallurgical analysis results, performance calculations, and his own memo from 1949. Admiral, I have analyzed the physical blade recovered from the Norway crash, measured every dimension, tested alloy composition, ran calculations using our most sophisticated aerodynamic models. The evidence is irrefutable. The Soviets have achieved a breakthrough in transonic propeller design that American theory said was impossible. Evidence can be misinterpreted. Not this evidence, sir. Harrison's voice was steady despite the fear. Despite knowing his career was ending with the next words. This blade exists. It works. Soviet Bear bombers fly with these propellers at speeds exceeding 520 miles per hour. Those are facts, not interpretations. General Curtis LeMay leaned forward, the same man who had dismissed Soviet capabilities 10 years earlier. Are you telling me we've been wrong about Soviet technological capabilities for an entire decade? Harrison met his eyes. The career-ending moment. Tell a comfortable lie and preserve status. Or tell uncomfortable truth and face consequences. Yes, General, we've been wrong. I've been wrong. He pulled out the photocopy of his 1949 memo, passed copies around the table. I personally reviewed Soviet technical papers in 1948 describing these innovations. I dismissed them as impractical theory. That was a catastrophic error, mine specifically. The American military establishments generally. Silence filled the room. Officers looked at Harrison's memo, reading his words, understanding that the man before them was admitting public failure, was destroying his own reputation to tell the truth. Why should we believe you now, LeMay asked, if you were wrong then? Because then I was too proud to imagine Soviets could innovate where Americans could not. Now I've held the evidence in my hands, spent 3 months trying to prove it wrong, trying to find a flaw in Soviet design, trying to protect my pride. And I failed. The evidence is incontrovertible. My pride is irrelevant. Admiral Burke spoke quietly. What do you recommend? Harrison took a breath. This was the moment, the recommendation that would either save his career or end it. Immediate crash program to develop American transonic propellers using principles we've discovered through Soviet blade analysis. Expanded theoretical research into shockwave management. Complete reassessment of Soviet engineering capabilities across all domains. He paused. The next part was most controversial. And sir, I recommend we publicly acknowledge Soviet achievement in this area. not as a propaganda defeat, as motivation. American engineers need to understand they're competing against genius, not incompetence. Pride made us complacent. Humility will make us better. LeMay's face was stone. You want us to tell the American public the Soviets beat us. I want us to tell the American public we're capable of learning from everyone, including enemies. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's what makes America exceptional. Not that we're always first, but that we're willing to learn from anyone, to admit when we're wrong, to pursue truth over comfortable lies. Bold statement from a man asking us to fund $1 billion research program. Honest statement from a man who just spent 3 months discovering how catastrophically wrong our assumptions have been. Pride nearly cost us the Cold War admiral. Humility might help us win it. The room erupted in argument. Half the officers wanted to accept Harrison's recommendations. The other half wanted to bury the report and protect American image. Admiral Burke raised his hand. Silence returned. Harrison's report will be classified at highest level, but his recommendations will be implemented. We will develop American transonic propellers. We will reassess Soviet capabilities. And gentlemen, we will do it quietly. Not because we're hiding failure, but because strategic advantage comes from learning without advertising our ignorance. He looked at Harrison. Your honesty is noted, Dr. Harrison. Your career may suffer for it, but your country is safer because of it. That's service. Real service. Dismissed. Some of you made decisions like Harrison's. Told truth that cost you promotions, cost you friendships, maybe cost you jobs. But you did it because integrity mattered more than comfort. Because protecting others mattered more than protecting yourself. That's what Harrison did. That's what your generation understood. That some things are worth more than personal success. Harrison left the briefing knowing his career was over. The report would be implemented, but buried. His name would be associated with intelligence failure, not with the courage to admit it. Former colleagues would avoid him. Students would question whether his teaching could be trusted. But his children would be safer. American air defenses would improve. The next generation of engineers would learn humility alongside technical skills. That was worth it. That was always worth it. But before we see how the story ends, return to the moment of triumph. Night after the successful engine test. November 12, 1952. Design Bureau 51 cafeteria transformed into a celebration hall. Tables pushed together. Food brought from Moscow by truck. Luxuries Soviet engineers rarely saw. Real luxuries. Not propaganda about abundance, but actual abundance. Beef stroganoff. Actual beef, not substitutes. Cooked in cream sauce with mushrooms and onions. Served over egg noodles. The kind of meal most Soviet citizens experience only at weddings or major holidays. Black bread. Fresh, not the stale loaves they normally chewed. Still warm from the oven. With butter. Real butter, yellow and rich. Georgian wine. Deep red. From vineyards of Stalin's homeland. Vodka for toasts. Clear and cold and strong enough to burn going down. Food that said, you have earned this, you have survived, you may live to see tomorrow. Sokolov stood at the head of the table, Maria beside him. For the first time in 18 months, he could eat without fear, nodding his stomach. The engine worked. Stalin's deadline was achievable. The Gulag was not waiting. Not yet. Not if they maintained momentum. He raised his glass. The room fell silent. Even drunk engineers knew when to listen. To Dmitry Volkov, Sokolov said, his voice carrying to every corner, who solved the problem we all said was impossible. Engineers stood, raised glasses high, some crying again. To Volkov, Dmitry Volkov was embarrassed by the attention, stood reluctantly when everyone turned to look. But Elena stood beside him, her arm around his waist, a smile on her face he had not seen in months. Pure joy uncomplicated by fear. To my husband, Elena said quietly, loud enough for nearby engineers to hear, who finally came home. The celebration lasted until dawn. Engineers who had worked themselves to exhaustion for 18 months were finally allowed to relax, to drink, to laugh, to tell stories, to believe they might survive this project and see their families again in peacetime. Some of you celebrated victories like this, Promotions after years of struggle. Projects completed after endless nights. Moments when everything came together and you allowed yourself to feel relief. That's what these Soviet engineers felt. Not politics, not ideology, just human joy at succeeding against impossible odds. Stories end, lives end. Even stories of impossible achievements end in deaths that give meaning to lives lived. Viktor Sokolov died in 1972, age 75, heart attack at his drafting table. Still working, still designing, because engineers like him never truly retired. Maria, age 70, and daughter Natasha, 42, were at his bedside. Did I do enough? Victor's last words. The question that had haunted him for 20 years. The question survivors of Stalin's terror always asked. You changed the world, Papa, Natasha said, holding his hand. Proved Soviet engineers could match anyone. Saved yourself from the gulag. Raised a family. That is enough. That is more than enough. Dmitry Volkov lived to see the Soviet Union collapse. Died in 1995. Age 78. Elena, 66, beside him. Married 1947. No children. Work had consumed everything. Andrei's letter was buried with him, in his jacket pocket, where it had been every day for 53 years. Promise kept. Purpose fulfilled. Mikhail Petrov died in 2018, age 109, one of the last surviving test pilots from Stalin's era. Katya had died in 2003. His sons were now old men, 76 and 73. Before death, he was interviewed by an aviation historian about dangerous test flights. November 12, 1952 was closest to death, when the propeller cracked, when I had 7 minutes to decide, eject and lose the aircraft or land and risk dying. I chose to land because ejecting meant failure, meant Sokolov goes back to the gulag. Volkov gets shot. Everyone who worked on the program gets punished. I had the skill to land, so I landed. That's what test pilots do. Risk death so others can live. 2024, 72 years after the first engine test. The Bear bomber was still flying, still on patrol, still proving that good engineering transcends political systems. Approaching 50 miles off the Alaska coast, American F-22 fighters scrambled from Elmendorf Air Force Base. 2 aircraft, supersonic interceptors costing $200 million each. Technology that would have seemed like science fiction to Petrov and Harrison. Lieutenant Sarah Harrison led the intercept, age 28, third-generation military. Her grandfather had served in the Air Force during the Cold War. Never talked about his work. Took secrets to the grave when he died in 2008. She didn't know her grandfather was Dr. Robert Harrison. Didn't know he had analyzed this exact aircraft type 64 years earlier. Didn't know he had sacrificed his career to tell the truth about Soviet genius. He never told his family. Some things stayed classified even after death. She flew alongside the massive bomber, took photographs, monitored communications. A ritual performed dozens of times each year. Russian bomber probes. American fighters respond. Nobody shoots, nobody escalates. Just professionals doing jobs the Cold War no longer required, but habits persisted. The Russian pilot initiated an unusual conversation. His English was good. American fighter, this is Bear. Beautiful aircraft you fly. Sarah responded per protocol. Bear, this is Eagle 1, thank you. Your aircraft has impressive longevity. Da. 72 years old, this design. Your grandfather's generation built it, yes. They feared each other, built weapons to destroy each other. Now grandchildren fly together peacefully. This is good, no? Sarah looked at the massive bomber. 8 counter-rotating propellers still spinning at speeds American engineers once said were impossible. Still flying. Still proving that desperation drives innovation. Still teaching lessons Cold War generations learned in blood and sweat and tears. Affirmative, Bear. This is good. That night she researched the Bear design. Curious about the bomber that had outlasted the Soviet Union. That flew longer than any combat aircraft in history. Learned about impossible propellers, about CIA analysis, about an American engineer who admitted being wrong, found her grandfather's name in declassified documents, his signature on a 400-page report, the analysis that changed American propeller development, and the admission of failure that took courage. She printed the documents, took them to her father the next weekend. He had no idea. Harrison had never discussed classified work with family. Dad did this. Her father reading the signature on 40-year-old intelligence reports. Analyzed Soviet bomber admitted American experts were wrong. He learned from the Soviets, Sarah said. Admitted they were better at this one thing. Made America safer by telling the truth instead of comfortable lies. Her father held the documents, thinking about the parent he barely knew, the man who died with secrets. He told me something when he was dying, her father said slowly. He said pride is the enemy of truth. Never forget that. I didn't understand. Now I do. Robert Harrison retired from the CIA in 1975, age 66, 34 years designing propellers. The last 9 years learning from Soviets, learning humility, learning that being wrong is sometimes more valuable than being right if you're willing to learn from it. He taught at MIT until 1985. His courses incorporated Soviet techniques. His textbooks acknowledged Soviet contributions. His lectures emphasized humility over pride. He died in 2008, age 99, a nursing home outside Boston. A former student visited days before his death, a man who had taken Harrison's courses in the 1970s, who learned about propeller design and humility in equal measure. The student brought coffee, black strong the way Harrison always drank it. Weak tea and stale bread were Soviet engineering diet. Strong coffee was American. Harrison drank it grateful for abundance he had taken for granted in youth. Do you regret your career? The student asked. The question he had wanted to ask for 30 years. Harrison was silent a long time, watching rain outside the window, thinking about the frozen hangar in Nevada, the impossible blade, the decade of American development lost to pride, the career destroyed by admission of failure. I regret my arrogance, he said finally, each word chosen carefully. I regret dismissing Soviet papers in 1949. I regret assuming American superiority made learning from enemies unnecessary. Those regrets will die with me. He sipped his coffee, savoring the simple pleasure, abundance that hadn't tasted like ashes. But I don't regret learning humility. That blade taught me the most important lesson of my life. Genius can come from anywhere. Innovation respects no borders. Truth doesn't care about politics or nationality or comfortable assumptions. Was it worth it, destroying your career to tell the truth? Harrison smiled, the first genuine smile the student remembered seeing. My children grew up in a safer world because I told the truth. American air defenses improved. The next generation of engineers learned to question assumptions. That was worth everything it cost me. That was always worth it. Some of you learned the same lesson Harrison learned, that being wrong doesn't make you a failure, that admitting mistakes takes more courage than never making them, that teaching the next generation humility matters more than teaching them to always be right. That's wisdom your generation earned. That's a legacy worth passing down. The story of the Bear's impossible propellers is about more than engineering, more than the Cold War, more than competition between superpowers that threaten to destroy the world. It's about what humans achieve when pressure is absolute, when failure means death, when comfortable assumptions are stripped away and only truth remains. The propellers keep spinning. Over the Arctic Ocean, that distinctive drone echoes across frozen water. Not just the sound of an old bomber on patrol, the sound of possibility itself. Sound reminding us that the limits we accept are only the limits we choose, that boundaries drawn by authorities are not always boundaries, that the accepted wisdom of experts is not always wise. Every time a modern engineer looks at a problem seeming unsolvable and asks whether there's another approach the spirit of Volkov's team lives on. Every time a designer questions an assumption everyone takes for granted, they follow the footsteps of Soviet pioneers. Every time someone attempts something experts say is impossible, they honor engineers who proved experts wrong. And every time we admit we're wrong, really wrong, publicly, wrong career, endingly wrong, and choose truth over pride, we honor Harrison's legacy. Your generation understands this. You lived through the Cold War, built fallout shelters, practiced duck and cover drills, served in the military when nuclear war seemed inevitable. You remember the fear, but you also remember the values that helped you through it. Truth over comfortable lies. Learning from anyone including enemies. courage to admit mistakes, humility in the face of evidence. These aren't political values, they're American values, traditional values, values that made America exceptional, not because we were always first, but because we were always willing to learn. Harrison embodied those values. Volkov embodied them too, though he would never admit it. Both men proved that genius knows no borders. That innovation transcends politics. That truth matters more than pride. The propellers keep spinning. The lessons keep teaching. And somewhere perhaps Harrison's spirit watches his granddaughter escorting the bomber he helped America understand. Knows his uncomfortable truth mattered. Knows his sacrifice was worth it. Because America's greatest strength has never been believing we're always right. It's been having the courage to learn when we're wrong. That truth transcends generations, transcends Cold Wars and hot wars, and all conflicts dividing humans, transcends politics and ideology, and comfortable assumptions. The propellers keep spinning. 72 years. Still flying, still teaching. And the sound echoing across the Arctic Ocean is not just a bomber from another era. It's the sound of every impossible thing that became possible when someone refused to accept no. It's the sound of genius knowing no borders. It's the sound of innovation respecting no politics. It's the sound of truth mattering more than pride. It's the sound of the future arriving, one revolution at a time. Listen carefully. The propellers are still spinning. And that sound you hear is not just history. It's a lesson for today, for your children, for every generation that follows. The lesson that pride is the enemy of truth, that learning from anyone, even enemies, is strength, not weakness. That courage to admit mistakes matters more than the comfort of never making them. Your generation understood this, lived it, fought for it. Now it's time to pass that wisdom down, because the next generation needs it as much as yours did, maybe more. The propellers keep spinning, the lessons keep teaching, and America stays great by staying humble enough to learn, always.